Welcome back everyone to the PC-12 Emergency Procedures course, continuing this week with Stab Trim Runaway. Stab trim is up here on the tail. This is the horizontal stabilizer. And in the PC-12 we do not have elevator trim. This entire horizontal stabilizer trims for pitch trim. So the emergency today is that our stab trim has run away. So here's the scenario. You're climbing through 400 feet after takeoff and retract the flaps. As the flaps retract, you begin to apply pitch trim by holding the trim activation trigger and using the hat switch on the yoke. You release the hat and trigger, but the trim continues to run. Control forces are building and the trim system is not responding to inputs. What should you do? So in this scenario, we've just taken off. The autopilot is not connected, so we're hand flying the airplane. We apply trim and release the trim controls, but the trim continues to run. This is actually a scenario that we practice in the sim at flight safety. And you have a stab trim runaway in this scenario. So the trim interrupt procedure must be used immediately for memory. You will not have time to reference the eQRH. Control forces will become very heavy. So this is a scenario where we have to just know what to do, because we certainly do not want to be fumbling around with the eQRH as the trim is running away at low altitude like that. And we just need to know how to interrupt it. Luckily, the procedure is very simple, and that is outlined here. So this is the eQRH, but again, we won't have time to actually pull this out. So we need to remember what to do. So here's the trim runaway indication. Uncommanded trim operation, rapidly increasing out of trim forces and or pitch trim runaway, medium pitch warning tone. If you're hearing that, you have a trim runaway. Step 1 is trim interrupt switch. Switch this to interrupt. That's on the center console or the center pedestal. And here's an image of that. It's under this plexiglass guard here. So we would lift that guard and switch this to interrupt. It's in norm now, so we would switch that up to interrupt, and that will remove power from all three trim systems in the airplane: the aileron trim, rudder trim, and stab trim. Okay, so that should stop the problem. If the cause autopilot trim green advisory caption and or the autopilot trim light on the triple trim indicator is on, I'm going to show you those. So this is the triple trim indicator. And if this light right here above the stab trim is lit up, that means that the autopilot is running stab trim to that stabilizer. And or if we look down on the cause and we see this autopilot trim green advisory light illuminated, we know that the autopilot is running trim. So if you haven't taken my systems bootcamp course, there are two stab trim systems in the airplane. There's one servo for the manual trim and there's one servo for the autopilot trim. So in this step, we're just trying to determine which system is applying the input to the trim that we don't want to be happening. So in this case, if both of these lights are not illuminated, like in our scenario here, we know the autopilot trim servo is not the problem. Okay, so we're checking that. So we can skip these steps. If the cause autopilot trim green advisory caption and or the autopilot trim light on the triple trim indicator is not on, like in our simulated scenario here, step 2 is circuit breaker of the failed trim, pull. We're looking for the stab trim circuit breaker, and they give you the location of that breaker right here. It's on the battery bus, left-hand panel, front alpha 1. So we're not looking for the aileron trim, the stab trim alternate, which is the autopilot servo, or the rudder trim. So we want this one here. Luckily, it's very easy to find. Okay, so here's a picture of the left-hand circuit breaker panel, alpha 1. So this is alpha up here, here is 1, this is the battery bus, and you can see this top right breaker is stab trim. So this is the breaker that we want to pull to disable the manual stab trim servo. So we pull that breaker, and then trim interrupt switch back to norm. So we're switching this back to norm, and that will give power back to the rudder and the aileron trim, but we've pulled the breaker for the stab trim, so that one will not come back on. And then note, reduce speed if control forces are high. If the main stabilizer trim has failed, pitch trim, use alternate stab trim. So that's this switch over here on the center pedestal. This is actually the autopilot servo. We're having manual control of that using the switch here because our manual has failed. So we'll have to reach over here anytime we want to make a stab trim input and use that switch for the duration of the flight to do that, because we're down to only the autopilot servo for the stab trim. So that's how we'll control our trim for the remainder of the flight. And then it says, note the autopilot will disconnect when trim interrupt is operated. So the autopilot will disconnect anytime that trim interrupt switch is switched. In our scenario here, the autopilot was not connected anyway. So at that point, the situation's under control. You can use the alternate stab trim to retrim the airplane, and then you'd probably want to come around and land at the departure airport. But if you needed to, you could continue that flight just using the alternate stab trim system as well. And that is it. So next on the agenda is the emergency gear extension procedure. So if we lose our hydraulic pump, I'll show you the steps to hand pump the gear down. And if you're not a channel member, I do actually have a series going of these videos on the membership side. If you're interested in becoming a member, I will put a link down in the description below to give you access to the rest of these videos, as well as the entire systems bootcamp course and the PC-12 weather and flight planning course as well. And that's it for now. Thanks everybody for watching, and I will see you on the next one.